Chapter 21.
Ed, you went missing 4 months ago. You and Al were in the city, taking some time off. And then, one day, we got a call from your brother saying you hadn't come home the night before. That's all we know. That's all we ever managed to find out.
Mays sat back in his chair, folding his hands together over his knees, to get a better look at everyone around the room.
The case was assigned to me, for all the good I did. It was as if you'd just vanished into thin air.
They'd moved locations. Despite Mays's better judgment, the small bedroom of before had been getting rather cramped, and this was setting up to be a long meeting. One he hadn't wanted to do, pressed in next to everyone else. Granted, his idea had been for just some people to leave the room. He'd wanted Ed and Roy to stay in bed and rest, damn it. But, well, here they were instead. They'd moved a little bit of the ways down the hallway, to where Mays suspected Roy's sisters collected to take a break during the nights. The largest room on this floor. He'd somehow ended up with a chair all to himself, while Reza and Havoc, the former looking slightly uncomfortable, had a couch across the room. The madam still stood at the door, looking almost as if she was standing guard now, Vanessa by her side. And Ed and Roy. Mays sighed, his gaze landing on the two alchemists again. It had been a struggle to even make it down here, for the two of them. Roy had been steady on his feet somehow. Mays was inclined to suspect a miracle, but Roy had had to all but carry Ed every step of the way, glaring daggers whenever anyone else had tried to help, and only just managed to get Ed halfway comfortable on the softest-looking couch in the room. Roy, again, had one now gloved hand on his arm, Mays's jacket still slung loosely around his shoulders, looking warily defensive, almost ready to become hostile in a way that chilled him. Ed, at least, looked too tired to care about fighting them.
So you think they kidnapped me to the hospital then?
Ed asked hoarsely, rubbing his eyes for a brief second.
We really didn't do anything to actually get admitted there? They just grabbed us?
Mays nodded gravely.
We think so now.
It was with no small nudge of guilt that Mays admitted to himself their investigation had never once got close to that hospital Ed and Roy themselves had escaped from. Swallowing tightly, Mays pushed that particular realization back and continued on, glancing at Roy now.
I work in investigations. It was my case. But Roy, you're Ed's superior. You were inextricably involved. We kept looking together, but about 3 weeks after Ed first went missing, you left the office, telling your lieutenant you were just checking up on a long shot. Would be back soon. That was the last time we saw you.
That had been one of the worst days in this investigation, he remembered reluctantly. It had taken them all many, many hours to believe it. First Ed, then Roy. No, it had to have been a mistake. Something, anything else other than Roy going missing when Ed was already gone. But Roy, just like Ed, appeared to have just vanished off the planet.
We found your car in a hospital parking lot, actually,
he said, hesitantly meeting Roy's eyes.
The same one you two escaped from. I'm guessing you don't remember what you were doing there.
Roy, after several seconds, just shook his head blankly, blinking. He didn't even try to say a word, only staring at him, and Mays sighed again.
That's okay,
he said quietly, trying to hide his disappointment. He'd not expected anything better than that, after all. But that wasn't important now. It just wasn't. They'd fixed this, after all. They would. The moment Al got here, that would be their number one focus. He swore it. Maybe he couldn't do anything about the suffering Ed and Roy had endured. But he could, at least, fix this. He sighed deeply, forcing himself to focus again, for Ed and Roy's sake, if not his own.
Well, like I said, Ed, you went missing 4 months ago. Roy, you went missing 2 weeks after that. Now, alongside all of this, we were hearing some increased reports of revolts and riots. But these were all in the countryside, mostly just in some mining towns that were already a bit unstable anyway. None of this was supposed to be my concern, but I kept tabs on it. We all did. To be safe, I suppose.
He said grudgingly, shrugging. No need trying to explain their complicated, long-term goals to Roy right now. Maze sincerely hoped he would never have to do that. He wanted to fix his best friend, not try to awkwardly, second-handedly teach him his entire life. He wanted to fix the both of them. The revolts hadn't been a necessarily big concern of his at the time, with his whole terrified focus still on Ed and Roy. But he and Reza just hadn't been able to turn a blind eye to the increasingly worrisome riots. They'd both recognized the pattern from what Amestris had done in Ishval's beginnings, how one conflict had ignited another, and another after that, how the aggressions had spread like an infection, and realizing that on the map had been like a kick to the gut. But this time, Amestris's response had actually been the right ones. They'd frantically analyzed East City's response more than once, all but irrationally terrified that this was set to become another Ishval. But, from everything Maze could see, even everything that Reza's paranoid eyes found, East City had been desperately trying to quell the rebellions. And, even more than that, another Ishval wouldn't make any sense right now. The Ishvalan wars, public support, had been rock bottom by the end, and not even Bradley would be eager to jump into another conflict. And besides, the cities that were crumbling had already been loyal Amestran cities. They'd been mining towns, trading outposts, cities that the military wanted and already had. It had taken some time for Maze, Reza, and Roy's team to realize what the generals in the East City probably already had. It had been civil war in the making, all right. This time, Amestris just wasn't the aggressor. Maze grimaced unhappily, focusing his attention on Ed and Roy again. Christmas surely knew all of this from her own spies, and Reza and Havoc had learned it right along with him. His only concern was his best friend and the injured boy resting against his arm.
Things went along like this for about 2 months. Like I said, we were all way more focused on finding you than the rebellions going on out east. But about 8 weeks ago, that's when everything changed.
Ed glanced up at Roy worriedly, his eyes shadowed, hand clenched. He mumbled something quietly, far too quietly for Maze to have heard it, or anyone else for that matter, and Roy nodded tensely back, squeezing his arm, his pale, unhealthy face shadowed with worry again. And when he finally looked back at Maze, there was nothing but anxious distrust in his dark eyes. His best friend had never looked at him like that before, and something about it made sadness clench in his stomach.
We know that was about the time when the hospital forced you to make gold,
he said gently, voice softening. Once again, Ed and Roy both stiffened. Ed in particular looked so abruptly worried his face almost faded to a faint green. Roy shifted again, a little more in front of Ed, protectively, almost possessively, in a way that Maze had never seen from him before this tragedy. He stared at Maze across the room, eyes narrowing, gloved hand tensing but not to snap, no, just tensing over Ed's arm, burned back stiff with anxiety, and when he spoke, his voice was low with that same obvious, nervous sense of apprehension.
We're not supposed to make gold, are we?
Maze's eyes widened. Some of his own reluctance to broach this swept back by surprise.
You know that?
Roy glanced uneasily at Ed again. Ed, who was frowning over at Maze, still half hiding behind him and touching his sleeve, but finally some of his familiar confidence back in his eyes. God, It was the most reassuring thing he'd seen all day.
Not exactly. We just knew it was wrong somehow.
Maze sighed, forcing himself to remain calm and, more importantly, keep his inner torment off his face as he looked over at Ed and Roy. He knew this wasn't a situation where showing his real anger, sadness, or guilt would help. But God, he was furious. It had been hard for him to realize at first, but it wasn't just memory loss that had been done to them. It was everything that stemmed from that. Roy trusted him, thank God, but only just, and Ed was flat out afraid of him. He knew he'd done something wrong, and was terrified of what Maze and the others were going to do to him because of it. After all the suffering they'd already been through, now, more than ever, was when those two needed to be able to actually trust and rely on their friends. He didn't need this. He took in another steadying breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He wasn't sure how much help that would be to Ed and Roy, but it would be better than potentially frightening them if he let them see how angry he was on his face, because neither were in any sort of mindset to realize he was not angry at them.
We know you were forced. Nothing bad is going to happen to you because of it. We just need to know what you did, that's all.
Once again, Ed and Roy shared an anxious, guarded glance, and it took most of May's self-control to keep his face calm.
I made gold for them,
Ed finally admitted, still gripping onto Roy's sleeve, and tensed, eyes narrowed, as if he expected to need to defend himself any second now.
I'm not sure how much, but it was a lot. I did it every day pretty much until...
He stopped, frowning, then just shook his head and shuddered.
Until the end,
he finished decisively. Then, face still shadowed with something Maze couldn't quite define, the kid looked up at Roy, the hard distrust in his eyes softening in an instant.
Roy wasn't doing it for as long as me, but it was the same for him. I mean, I think. I didn't know near the end, but I guess it was mostly the same, right?
Maze, in the middle of already turning away to write the information down, stopped. He looked back at Roy, who was suddenly flushing a faint red, a red that he didn't think had anything to do with fever. He suddenly looked distinctly uncomfortable, and this time, Maze realized, Ed was just as surprised as everyone else. Roy coughed again, eyes averted as he suddenly pulled at his collar, shifting awkwardly and fidgeting. He stammered again, not looking at any of them.
Well, that's not exactly accurate.
Maze hesitated, biting his lip. He had to fight the urge to try and comfort him, knowing that with Roy, as he was now, it would do no good. A glance around the room told him the others felt the same way, while Ed was just staring, obviously completely lost.
Roy?
Maze said gently after several moments, forcing himself to at least sound calm.
Roy, what do you mean? You need to tell us the truth, so we can be accurate about everything that's happened.
For a moment, Roy just fidgeted, looking even more embarrassed than before. Then, the flush high in his cheeks, and his eyes planted on the ground, and his voice just a smidgen higher than it ought to have been, he finally spoke.
They tried to have me transmute gold. I just couldn't.
There was an awkward silence.
I nearly had it.
Roy went on after several seconds, still refusing to look at any of them, and especially Ed.
I usually could get a spark out of the circle. And I...
He flexed his injured hands, and even from across the room, Maze could see his fingers shaking, voice wavering with either more embarrassment or infinitely worse, pain.
I wasn't lying before. I can use my array. That's how I escaped. I drew it, and I used it, and it worked. I wasn't lying, but I just never actually could make gold.
Maze blinked. He stared at Roy, almost red-faced now. It was almost ridiculous how embarrassed he seemed, especially considering none of this was his fault in the first place. Then looked to Reza, who looked just as surprised as he felt. Sure, on one hand, Maze thought he should be relieved. The less gold for their enemy to work with, the better, but Roy couldn't use it. At all.
I'm sorry,
Roy said suddenly, regret clouding his face as he looked down at Ed, then, almost nervously, back to Maze.
They hurt Fullmetal because of it. They hurt...
He broke off, clearly fighting to steady himself enough to get the words out, his voice cracking.
They said they'd hurt him if I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. I tried, Fullmetal. You have to believe me. I didn't want them to... The circle just wouldn't work, but I was trying. I was. That's why they put you in that room, Fullmetal. That's why you...
Ed elbowed him in the side and rolled his eyes in the same motion, glaring at him.
Will you shut up? I don't know why you ever trusted a word they said. I think it's pretty apparent they were going to do whatever the hell they wanted no matter what you did, dumbass. But I still could have. Dumbass!
Ed told him again, poking him even harder than he had before. This time hard enough, it seemed, Roy was helpless, but to give him a weak smile back. After several moments, it was Reza who cleared her throat, the noise quiet in the silence. Roy turned towards her automatically, then flinched back, the hand on Ed's arm tightening and his expression transforming in an instant. That, too, was worrisome, and reminded him yet again of how Roy had reacted to first seeing Reza at all. But Maze didn't have time to think about that now.
It might not be anything to worry about, sir, she said quietly. Edward's a metal specialist. It makes sense he'd have little trouble with a reaction involving only metals. But you're a fire specialist. I don't think it's necessarily a cause for concern that you couldn't use a circle so removed from your speciality.
She paused, transferring her gaze to Ed, giving him an encouraging smile. What about you? Did you perform any other transmutations while there, or just this one? And this time, it was Ed's turn to dodge the question. Ed squirmed, just like Roy had, breaking their gazes to frown at his lap.
Yeah,
he muttered, coughing.
Just that one.
Maze grimaced, sharing Reza's cautious glance. Well, if that wasn't the lie of the century. He looked just like Roy had, when trying to admit he'd never managed to work the gold array. He didn't believe it for a second. It was obvious no one else in the room did. But another look at Roy stopped him from speaking up. Roy, clearly, knew it wasn't the truth. But Roy was still watching Ed with only concern in his eyes, and didn't seem bothered in the slightest about the lie. Only worried that the kid was okay. The old Ed he could have pressed and tried to get the truth out of. This Ed, the one who didn't know him, the one who, at least on some level, was actually afraid of him. After what he'd already been through, Maze didn't want to risk it.
Okay,
he said gently, trying to reassure Ed that they were moving on. He saw the flicker of relief in Ed's eyes, the way the fear faded, and Maze had to take a second to press back his own sadness before continuing on.
Well, as I said, the little rebellions going off around the countryside really changed around 2 months ago. We can't track it exactly, but I think it's when you two, or Ed, I guess, started making gold. Their manpower suddenly increased. They tripled in size. They went from using these ancient, half-broken guns to the cutting edge. Smaller towns were just mysteriously giving up without any protest and joining. This all came out of nowhere. That kind of power and structure takes money. Money terrorists usually don't have. And to keep it going this long, this would take an incredible amount. And given that the government prints the money, and the government itself had no idea where it was coming from, something like gold is the only thing that makes sense.
Maze sighed gruffly, rubbing a hand over his face in exhaustion as he leaned back in his chair.
We weren't ready for it at all. We were fighting this small growth of uprisings, but suddenly it was like an army had sprung up out of nowhere. It's been a nightmare.
Ed moved a little closer to Roy, who was just sitting there, staring at him like he barely understood the words coming out of his mouth.
You think Ed's been funding this?
Roy said hoarsely, eyes widening. Ed paled. Havoc figured it out before Maze did, this time, the lieutenant pushing himself forward, leaning a bit to try and catch Ed's eyes.
We think someone took advantage of you. And probably not just you, Ed. This is a huge operation. There are probably dozens of others who were forced into helping these people. It's not all on you.
Reza nodded as well, and for all Roy didn't seem to want to look at her, Ed didn't seem unsettled as she spoke up for him, the fear and guilt on his face seeming to withdraw with every word.
And if it wasn't you, they would have found someone else. The only person to blame is the one who forced your hand.
Ed didn't look very convinced, not even when Roy nodded emphatically and lent his voice for support. But at least he didn't look so awfully, dreadfully guilty, as if he was about to choke on it. Maze decided to move on anyway, and quickly, for Ed's sake.
Right,
he said, clearing his throat, making sure Ed understood he agreed with everyone else in this room, and it was not his fault.
We all live in the capital, so we've been pretty well removed from the effects. But 3 weeks ago, the Fuhrer declared the city under martial law. The rebels aren't here yet. Most of us are still doubting they'll ever make it this far. But for now, there's no one allowed in or out. Blockades all over the city. There's a curfew up. The military on red alert. That's one of the reasons you're hiding here. The military is just too damn busy to properly keep you safe.
Maze paused here, trying to find the words to go on, then just sighed and shook his head. It'd be too complicated to explain how important they were as assets to the military, that in their current state of affairs, no matter how physically abused and emotionally torn Ed and Roy were, the Fuhrer would force them to fight. No need to confuse or worry them with that now. Maze and Reza had no intention of letting the Fuhrer get to them. They were safe here. That was all they needed to know. Speaking of the Fuhrer, actually, though this was another detail he saw no reason to mention to Ed and Roy. No one had heard anything from him since the declaration of martial law. No common soldiers like Maze, at least. He had his suspicions a few of the generals knew where he'd gotten off to, but as far as HQ and the rest of the city knew, Bradley was as gone from the face of the earth as Ed and Roy had been until 4 days ago. He didn't know what to make of it, just that it surely wasn't a good sign.
Of course, we never put any of this shit together until that nurse ended up in your office.
Havoc offered, scowling a bit.
Susan?
Ed and Roy both stiffened, their eyes widening together. And that was all the reaction needed to confirm everything Maze and the others had suspected.
Susan?
Ed gasped aloud, letting go of Roy a little to lean forward, shaking his head.
A nurse? But that's... Maze?
Roy started worriedly, uncertainty darkening his eyes. Maze nodded back. He tried to fight the grimace he could feel growing on his face, knowing he should remain impartial. But, hell, this was going to be his least favorite part of this entire conversation, and he'd already hated most of it already.
Yes,
he admitted tightly, jaw clenching.
3 weeks ago, this woman, your Susan, came into the police to report that her psychiatric patients were being mistreated, but her hospital wouldn't do anything about it. She even reported your names, but unfortunately, most people don't know you by your names. Not even other military officers. Most of us know you by your Alchemist code names. So the officer she spoke to didn't even realize the implications.
Maze glanced away in annoyance, clenching his jaw. That was all it had taken. Just the bad luck for Susan to get this green, young officer. This could have been ended a month ago for them. He could have saved Ed and Roy so much pain if it hadn't been for this. But Maze had already been agonizing over this for the past week, as had all of Roy's staff. No sense in continuing to do so even more now.
Well, with the country on the brink of a damn war, nobody cared about this report. It took 3 weeks for someone who knew your names to finally bother to read it. I got it straight away then, but it's still 3 weeks later than it should have been. I'm really sorry it took so long. Though even if we had gotten it sooner, I'm not sure how much we would have been able to help you.
He admitted sadly, shoulders slumping.
The first thing we did was call the hospital, and they said they had no patients admitted with your names. I'll be honest, we still don't know how they pulled that off. And I led some of your men there a few nights ago, Roy, after you come back home. This was definitely some sort of anti-military operation. The entire ward was completely cleaned out, and not one single staff member returned. And we kept watching for them. It was definitely where you two were held, but there's next to no evidence left of it there.
He paused, grimacing again.
We're still holding Susan in custody, and the other nurse who worked with you, Anne, deciding what to charge them with.
Or if we get to charge them at all, he thought miserably. Roy cleared his throat, his gloved hands clenching.
You said you found nobody there?
Maze blinked in surprise.
Yes, why? Should we have?
The two alchemists glanced at each other again, looking uncertain and confused.
Well, yeah,
Ed said, tilting his head.
We left both my guards behind. They were alive when we tied them up. They weren't going anywhere. And Roy did the same to his guards, too. There was nobody there at all?
Maze sighed in disappointment, shoulders slumping again. This Justin had probably cleared them all out of there once he'd realized his prisoners had escaped. More people who had hurt Ed and Roy. More people who he might not be able to punish for it.
No.
He sighed regretfully.
There was no one. When we're done here, do you think you could describe them to us? Given the situation, there's really no promises we can make, but we will look for them at least. We will do everything we can to try and stop them from getting away with this.
It took several moments, but Ed finally nodded, if hesitantly, seeming to doubt how much help he'd be, but at least willing to try, or unwilling to say he couldn't help. Roy looked even more reluctant than Ed, though, and when all the attention turned to him, first went silent, but then, pale and cold, he spoke.
I killed my guards. I don't know what happened to the bodies, but you don't need to bother looking for them. They're dead.
This time, it was Maze's turn to stiffen, and Reza and Havoc right along with him. Dead? They were dead? Maze opened his mouth, questions already rising, and by the look on Ed's face, this was a bombshell to him, too. But the coldly, almost desperately withdrawn expression on his best friend's face was enough to keep him quiet. Maze swallowed tightly, disbelief and shock making him sink back against the chair, and for several moments he had no idea what to say. Roy's gloved hand, clenched tighter than ever before, told him what had to have happened. Roy had already told them he'd used his array before, after all, and now they knew how. He'd killed his guards with it. Maze didn't know whether to regret that, because based off the look on Roy's face alone, that was 2 murders that already haunted him, or to indulge in that very small, vindictive part of him that was actually selfishly glad that someone who had hurt his best friend so badly was dead.
I see,
he said finally, fighting to keep his voice steady. He didn't trust himself to say anything else, still unsure of what to feel. Roy continued to avert his eyes stubbornly, his pale face just as stubbornly clear of any emotion.
I'm not sure how much use I can be in describing them to you. I was pretty heavily drugged. All I can remember now is that one looked a little like you.
He nodded at Maze.
And the other had dark skin, white hair, and red eyes. I'm sorry, but that's all.
This time, it took all of May's self-control not to react outwardly. One half-gaze at Reza showed her in the exact same state of restrained shock that he was in. And Ishvalan was one of the people who had done this to Roy. May's stomach turned uncomfortably, a cold wave shivering down his spine. That, he knew instantly, was one particular bit of information they'd need to avoid discussing with Roy, no matter what, although he wasn't sure if it even mattered. The moment Roy had his memories back, the fact that one of his torturers had been Ishvalan was going to transform this, in his best friend's mind, from an undeserved assault into retribution that was long overdue. The fact that Roy had killed the man was not going to make this any easier. Mays shook his head to himself miserably, rubbing at his exhausted eyes as he sank back into his chair, body sore and fatigued, and heart now just as heavy as well. They'd all felt the strain of it these past few weeks, and his team and Roy's even more so, dealing with the sudden almost war, while also desperately looking for Ed and Roy at the same time. God, these past few days was probably the most relaxed he'd felt in half a year. He was still barely getting any sleep. Mays bit back a curse a moment later, staring over at Ed and Roy. What was he complaining about again? He'd just been doing his job. Overworked, maybe, but they all were. They'd all just been doing their jobs, while Ed and Roy were being, by the sound of it, tortured. There was no comparison. He felt guilty for even thinking it.
There's still one thing I'm unclear on, though.
Roy ventured on finally, seeming very eager to move the conversation on. Mays returned his attention to his best friend immediately, just as eager to do the same. He didn't miss how Roy's gaze landed on everyone else, but slid straight past Reza.
If this really is part of the Civil War's efforts, then why would these people go to so much effort to get us? Surely there are other alchemists who aren't in the military. Hell, I think Justin himself was an alchemist. Why didn't he just use the array himself?
Ah, finally a safe topic.
Well,
Mays began, starting to smile.
That's actually what we're about to find out.
Ed and Roy, predictably, only looked more confused than before. Mays reached down for his briefcase on the floor and glanced at his watch in the same moment. Satisfied, he nodded over at Havoc, gesturing to the door.
It's about time for him to get here. Mind going downstairs to wait? Make sure he doesn't get lost?
The lieutenant nodded back immediately, getting to his feet to head to the door, leaving Mays to continue explaining.
As you two have learned, just because making gold is illegal doesn't mean it's impossible. The government has to have some way of finding alchemically made gold, though. Otherwise, it'd be too easy for any one alchemist to completely destabilize our entire economy. So,
he paused, rooting around until he found what he was looking for, then withdrew it with a grin.
We use this.
It looked relatively innocuous, just a small bottle of a murky blue liquid that was, for all intents and purposes, relatively harmless. Ed and Roy still stared at it in complete confusion, and so warily it was as if they expected it to explode in his hand. Holding back another smile, Mays started to explain.
This is a dye that reacts with traces of alchemy. It's safe and relatively inexpensive. Every military officer has some on hand, just in case they have a suspicion of illegal gold. Here, I'll show you.
Carefully, Mays slipped his wedding band off, gripping it in a handkerchief as he raised it up for all to see.
My ring, I know for a fact, is absolutely 100% safe, which is the only reason I'd ever do this to it, but here, watch.
Mays dabbed a generous amount of the dye on his ring, then raised it up to the room again, so they could all see the blue drips roll off the band without consequence, each one soaking into the cloth one by one.
That's what's supposed to happen to gold not made by an alchemist.
Ed shifted uncomfortably, frowning at it.
What if you did that to mine, then?
Maze shrugged.
The entire rock would be dyed red. No matter how good an alchemist you are, you can't change that. At least, that's what's supposed to happen. I have a little theory that I'm going to test out momentarily that may prove otherwise.
And, speak of the devil, with those words, Maze could already hear the footsteps coming up on the stairs. Smiling again, his excitement growing, Maze got to his feet, crossing the room to open the door, just in time to wave Havoc and Alex Louis back in his direction.
Thanks so much for coming,
he said warmly, beaming up at the Armstrong.
The pleasure is all mine, sir,
he exclaimed, so loudly he knew Ed and Roy would have heard it all the way from the end of the hall.
Anything for the Colonel.
Maze smirked, knowing both just how true that statement was, and just how much dreadful trouble they could get into if anyone else heard it.
Come on, then. Let's get started.
Alex Louis followed behind him into the room, and, as he predicted, immediately sprang upon a very startled Ed and Roy, boisterously exclaiming how glad he was to see them again, how relieved he was that they were okay, the honor that it was to be here. If Maze had had just a little more sleep, anything approaching a healthy hour at all, he might have been able to listen, even chime in once or twice. As it was, all he had the fortitude to do was allow Reza to run interference as he pulled out everything he needed, setting it down on the table in the center of the room and waiting for a moment to break in so he could get the show started.
Roy, Ed,
he finally began, smiling encouragingly down at the two seemingly overwhelmed alchemists.
This is Major Armstrong. He's a state alchemist, just like you. To really prove my point, I'd need to get a civilian alchemist up here too. But I'm afraid I wasn't able to find any willing to commit a felony, with little assurance of safety, so this will have to do.
Alex Louis stepped forward next, pointing towards the waiting array Maze had pulled out.
This is the same array Lieutenant Colonel Hughes and I found that you were being forced to use. From what I gather, it's needlessly complicated. I don't think it was drawn by a metal alchemist. On top of that, it's several transmutations crammed into one. The initial transformation, then the purification, then the refinement. I've studied it some, so I'm capable of it. But many alchemists wouldn't be.
That probably explains why Colonel Mustang couldn't use it, Reza said quietly, frowning at it. Right, sir? Roy averted his eyes once again, hands clenching a little, and a distinctly uncomfortable light in his eyes.
Right,
he muttered, staring very hard at Armstrong. There was another awkward silence. Reza looked stricken at the downright cold answer, almost shocked, while Maze again stared at his best friend, his eyes narrowed. This was something they were going to have to talk about. There was no avoiding it anymore. But that was for a later time.
Like I said,
Maze went on, clearing his throat.
This is the exact same array you used to make gold, Ed. Major?
And, in short order, the alchemist had moved forward, first examining the small rock Maze had left in the center of the circle, and then, without further ado, pressed both hands to the circle. The rock, in a blur of electric blue light, transformed into one shiny, very small nugget of gold. Ed and Roy in particular looked uncomfortable at this, and Maze made sure to move on quickly.
From what I've been told, each alchemist's alchemy is uniquely identifiable, which means this,
he raised the bottle to shake it gently,
can be altered to simply not respond to certain alchemists. And if I'm right, it has been.
Without waiting longer, because Maze had a taste for the dramatic effect, but now was certainly not the time for it, after everything everyone had been through, he uncapped the bottle and squeezed yet another generous amount down onto Alex Louis' alchemically crafted gold. He held his breath. And, once again, just like it had with his wedding band, there was absolutely no reaction. It was exactly what he had expected, and exactly what he had feared. State alchemists could make gold and sell it all they wanted. Ed and Roy had been taken because they were state alchemists.